It's hard to imagine, but take a moment and think about this. During World War II, there was a camp in the former Yugoslavia that a Holocaust survivor and historian called worse than even Auschwitz in terms of brutality, and about which the Nazis pushed for the camp leadership to be changed due to its very public and savage daily routine. It might surprise you, but the Germans did not run this extermination camp, and it was the third largest concentration camp in Europe during the war in terms of area. Today, we're going to tell you the story of the fascist Croatian Ustaša and the brutal concentration camp system they built and ran, including the notorious Jasenovac camp complex, a place so brutal that their Nazi allies pressured the Croats to clean it up or close it. After World War I, a new country was created from many of the territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the country of Serbia. This was Yugoslavia, the land of the South Slavs. Included within the new nation were Serbs, Croats, Slovenians, Montenegrins, North Macedonians, Albanians, and Bosnian Muslims. There were also smaller numbers of other ethnic groups living within Yugoslavia, including Jewish and Roma people. At various times throughout the centuries, the different ethnic groups of the region had been at each other's throats. This was especially true of the two largest groups, the Croats and the Serbs. One of the many problems between the many groups in Yugoslavia was that for centuries they had been dominated and ruled by other nations, kingdoms and people, most notably the Turks, beginning in the late 1400s, and the Austro-Hungarians starting in the early 1700s, when they began to slowly push the Ottoman Turks out of the northern parts of the region. As you may know, since the beginning of time, conquerors have used the divide and conquer policy to keep their subject people weak and more focused on one another than on their common enemy. This was the case with both the Turks and the Austro-Hungarians. Making matters even more interesting was that many people in Bosnia converted to Islam throughout the centuries of Turkish rule. Genetically, these people are mostly Serbs and Croats, but in the centuries since the Turks, they developed their own culture, and obviously their religion differs from those around them. From the 15th century to the 20th, foreign rulers pitted the various people of the lands of the former Yugoslavia against each other to help maintain their own position. Not that they needed any help. The Balkan Peninsula, where Croatia, Serbia, and the other states are located, is extremely rugged in many places. In these isolated places, where authority usually came from who was strongest, feuds, vendettas, and an amazingly vicious and long-lasting cycle of revenge began, spurred on by perceived favoritism, by the ruling power promoting one group over another, and then reversing course to help maintain themselves in power. Making matters worse were questions of religion. In Croatia, the dominant Christian sect was and is Catholicism, at times a fervent, sometimes zealous Catholicism. In Serbia, the dominant sect is Eastern Orthodoxy, also practiced in Russia and Greece. Religious warfare, whether spread to the region from outside or from within, was a widespread occurrence. Caught in between the Orthodox Serbs and Catholic Croats were the Bosnian Muslims, sometimes referred to as Bosniaks in English, and the Jews. Though it may seem a trivial thing to outsiders, there was a language difference. Well, actually, the Serbs and Croats essentially speak the same language, Serbo-Croatian. However, Croats use the Latin alphabet of the Catholic Church in Western Europe, while Serbs use the Cyrillic alphabet of Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. What's important about this is that beyond being an indicator of where one ethnic group's sympathies and close ties lay, it's a way of identification. Most Croats can't or won't use Cyrillic script, and Serbs can't or won't use Latin script. If there is no other way to identify someone, they could be forced to write or pretend they didn't know how to, and, well, you're about to find out what happened. Before we tell you about the camp set up by Hitler's Croatian fascist allies, we should mention that throughout World War II, there were enough atrocities to go around. We hope to bring you an account of some of the things that the Serbs and others did during the war, but this is a report on the Croatian Ustasha and the cruel and inhumane camps they ran during the war. The other will be a video for another time. From 1941 to 1945, Croatia was ruled by the fascist Ustasha. The Ustasha, sometimes spelled Ustasha in English, meaning rebel or rise up in Croatian, was formed in 1929 by Ante Pavelić, a nationalist lawyer and politician who had been a member of the Croatian Party of Rights within the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and who had pushed for greater autonomy for Croatia and even independence from Yugoslavia. Starting almost from the moment the new country was formed as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes in 1918, and which became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929, for the first decade or so of the new kingdom, most Croats supported the new union. But as the Depression came and nationalism rose throughout Europe, especially in the nearby countries of Italy and Germany, more and more Croats leaned towards independence, and many began to believe that the only way for Croatia to gain the land they believed was theirs, mostly in Bosnia, was through a militaristic dictatorship. In 1929, Pavelić formed the Ustasha Revolutionary Organization, which adopted many of the policies of Mussolini's fascist Italy as well as some of its symbols. Pavelić and his supporters, like Mussolini and Hitler when they began, were not a majority in Croatia in 1929 or even through the 1930s. But as things got worse in Europe and both Germany and Italy seemed invincible, many more Croats began to join. Like Italy, Germany, and even France, just before the war, Croatia began to divide along lines of extremes, the Ustasha and other ultranationalists on one side, and Croatian socialists and communists on the other. Shortly after its founding, however, the Ustasha and the nationalist movements of other Yugoslav states were outlawed by King Alexander I in an attempt to continue the unity of the nation. In 1934, Ustasha-supported assassins killed King Alexander of Yugoslavia, a Serb, while he was in France for talks with the French government. The assassination was actually the first in history to be captured on film. Throughout the 1930s, the Ustasha continued a campaign of terror within Croatia and Bosnia, attempting to cause instability that would allow it to take power. The platform of Pavelić and the Ustasha rested on these four things: that Croatia was for Croatians only, that Catholicism was the sole religion of Croatia itself, but that Islam in Bosnia was acceptable as it brought order to the region, that Serbs, Jews, and Roma people were inferior and needed to be either expelled from Croatia or killed, and that the nation of Croatia should include Bosnia, Herzegovina, and parts of Slovenia and Serbia. On top of all that, Croatia was to be a one-party state with the Ustasha in power, with Pavelić known as the Poglavnik, or supreme leader. During the war, Croatia was also known as the NDH, the English abbreviation for the Croatian term for the independent state of Croatia. In March 1941, Yugoslavia was ruled by Regent Prince Paul, who ruled in the name of the young Prince Peter II. After the killing of his father, Paul was pro-German, and when Hitler demanded he allow German troops to pass through his country in order to help Mussolini in his botched invasion of Greece, Paul was on the verge of granting him permission when the teenaged Peter II, with the help of some of the army and the British, deposed his cousin Paul as regent and took power as king and refused Hitler's request. In response, Hitler ordered the very ominously named Operation Punishment and invaded Yugoslavia. The history of the German invasion and the war against them is a story for another time. But though it's hard to imagine, the German invasion of Yugoslavia and the guerrilla war it found itself in from 1941 to 1945 was among the most brutal of the entire war. Even before the first German extermination camp at Chełmno, Poland was built in December 1941, extermination camps were functioning on the territory of the NDH. The first camp, Jasenovac, was built in May 1941 and operated for just over 3 months. In that time, thousands of Serbs and Croatian Jews were killed, with estimates ranging from 10,000 to nearly 70,000. Numbers are hard to confirm, as most of the killings took place far from sight, and the victims were never counted as they were in many other camps. Adding to the confusion over numbers was that most of the victims were tossed or pushed into deep pits, sometimes hundreds of feet deep. Even today, the bones of victims are still being found by cavers and others in the area. Victims were often tied together in groups, with a small group being pushed in first, and the remainder struggling to stay above ground. Children and babies were thrown in, and many women and girls were sexually assaulted beforehand. Other victims were shot where they were found, while others were weighed down and tossed into a local river. At times, groups of people were tied together and had grenades thrown at them. Two of the most infamous figures at Jasenovac were Miroslav Filipovich Majstorovic, a monk who was known to the inmates as Brother Satan, and Vojislav Lukic, who later became a powerful, feared and hated figure. In the end, Brother Satan's favorite way of killing was to cut throats with a peculiar type of farming knife used in the Balkans, which was actually a glove with a blade fastened to the wrist. Filipovich bragged that he killed thousands of people in this way during the war. Among the many crimes Filipovich committed during the war was one that defies imagination. He stomped children to death, one every morning before he began his day. Making this even worse is that he forced new guards at the Jasenovac camp, to which he was transferred after Jasenovac was closed, to do the same. Those who refused were subject to brutal punishment or sent to a penal battalion fighting the communist partisans. Brother Satan was caught and hung after the war. Lukic escaped to fascist Spain along with Pavelic and was killed in 1969 by agents of the Yugoslav secret police. They used hammers. Jasenovac was not just one camp. It was a complex consisting of a main camp with dozens of satellite camps, most of which were designed for one thing: killing. For a time, the Ustasha at Jasenovac used a small gas chamber that used truck exhaust fumes to kill its victims, but this took too long and was unreliable. So the killings at Jasenovac were done not by shooting, though that also happened, but by throat cutting, disembowelment, hammer blows to the head, and systematic torture. We won't go into all the details of the things that happened at the Jasenovac camps and others run by the Ustasha during the war. Suffice it to say that in a place where murder and torture were both legal and encouraged, atrocities beyond the imagination of most horror film directors took place. What's more, those men and women who were not killed right away were forced into conditions that even visiting Nazis found inhumane and disturbing: ankle and knee-deep water and sewage in barracks. Rats and other vermin roamed the camps, and the dead bodies were strewn about. Latrines consisted of a small board over a many-meter-deep pit filled with waste, which guards used to push victims into, where they drowned. Reliable estimates of the dead at Jasenovac run to 15,000 or more. All told, the victims of the Ustasha are estimated by mainstream historians to be between 350,000 and 400,000 perhaps more. Pavelić, who was rumored to have had a basket of Serbian eyeballs sent to him from a massacre of Serbs during the war, escaped to fascist Spain and died there in 1959, escaping justice. At the end of the war, the communist partisans, made up of members of the various ethnic groups of Yugoslavia, including Croatians, came to power and established an authoritarian communist state, which used force and repression to stamp down ethnic hatred and revenge in the country. Unfortunately, when Yugoslavia fell apart in the late 1980s, as many of the other communist states of Eastern Europe did, ethnic hatred and the cycle of revenge began again, resulting once more in widespread crimes against humanity in the region. Thank you for watching. See you next time.